You are listening to Travel with the Backpacking Housewife podcast. I'm your host, Janice Horton, an ex-housewife, an empty nester, and normally a nomadic world traveller, who loves to discuss dreamy destinations all around the world, and in particular the pros and cons of midlife and senior travel, and about making the most of opportunities to travel in retirement, or what I like to call the golden age of travel. Welcome to episode 15. Over the past 2 weeks in episodes 13 and 14, I've been sharing with you my greatest travel experiences, and I really hope that you've enjoyed listening to my stories, and even more importantly, that you felt inspired to travel by them. This week, I've decided to counterbalance all the wonderful experiences that I've had while travelling by telling you about my scariest travel experiences. Simply because in a recent media interview, I was asked if anything scary had ever happened to me to make me feel unsafe while I was travelling. And I wouldn't be being entirely honest to only tell you about the great and amazing things that have happened to me after travelling around the whole world twice, exploring 56 countries over 7 nomadic years. Sometimes things can get a little bit scary when you suddenly find yourself outside your comfort zone. But it's also important to keep this all very much in perspective. Because I'm also aware that travel fear is something that keeps many people from reaching out and achieving their own dreams of living a life of travel and adventure. And in telling you these scary travel stories, it's certainly not my intention to put you off travel. It's the opposite, in fact. I want to encourage you to recognise and to accept your fears, knowing that they are completely natural and normal. And there is an awful lot you can actively do to keep yourself safe while travelling. In fact, the most important part of this podcast today is the part where I tell you my top 10 scary travel situations and what I've learned from them, and essentially how you can avoid them. And that knowledge, I'm hoping, will inspire you to travel with savvy confidence. Because in reality, travelling anywhere in the world shouldn't be any more dangerous than travelling in your own country. We all know that life itself is inherently dangerous, and being afraid of travel is just the same as being afraid of the unknown. Yet the unknown is simply something, either good or bad, that we haven't experienced yet. In the same way that a stranger could just be a friend whom we haven't met yet. To stay safe, we must keep our wits about us and learn to trust our own inbuilt intuition. We should be sensible, aware, prepared, and cautious. And importantly, we must learn to always trust our gut feelings. While travelling, I personally like to take on board astronaut and Commander Chris Hadfield's advice in his wonderful book, An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth. In his book, Commander Hadfield shares with us all the life skills that he learned as an astronaut, training to travel further away from home than most of us are ever likely to travel in our own lifetimes. Commander Hadfield says that first imagining and then anticipating all the things that might possibly go wrong while travelling, and then planning in advance exactly what you might like to do to tackle these imagined and anticipated situations will allow you to release the fears and the concerns that you have about keeping safe. So in the spirit of anticipation and in being fully prepared, in the same way that I've also shared a post on my website about mishaps and misadventures while travelling that you can read on thebackpackinghousewife.com, I'm now going to share with you 10 of my own real-life scary situations and how I dealt with them, and ultimately, and very importantly, what I learned from the experience about staying safe. And as a result, if you ever find yourself in the same scary situations, you might feel more prepared and less afraid to travel. Okay, here we go. My 10 scary travel situation stories. Number 1, finding ourselves in a notoriously dangerous part of town at midnight and during a blackout in Nassau, Bahamas. We'd been in the Bahamas for a few weeks, renting an Airbnb at Cable Beach just outside Nassau. One evening, my husband and I had travelled into town on a jitney bus to meet with a couple of new tourist friends whom we'd met earlier that day. we'd arranged to meet for dinner and drinks at the famous Arawak fish fry area. This is a strip of beachside seafood restaurants and street food stalls offering local foods that are a famous tourist attraction. We ended up staying out much longer than we'd intended. We were having fun and we found a nice bar with a good vibe, and when the bar closed, just around midnight, we were the last to leave. We decided that we'd all share a taxi back up the road, so we went out into the street to look for a taxi, but we found the street empty and quiet. We'd all had a few drinks, but I suddenly felt quite sober on realising that we might have put ourselves in a precarious situation. We'd been warned that this part of Nassau was a potentially dangerous place for tourists late at night. And then suddenly and unexpectedly, we were plunged into complete darkness. There were no lights anywhere, and we soon realised this was a power cut situation. We just stood there in the dark, not knowing what to do. There were no taxis on the street, there was nowhere open, and even the bar we'd been in was locked up. We used our phones as torches, but then realised we didn't have any taxi numbers. Then suddenly, a big truck appeared out of the darkness and stopped right beside us. I was scared. The four of us were caught in its headlights, and we must have looked like frightened rabbits in the spotlight. Luckily for us, the driver wasn't about to rob or kidnap or murder us. He simply wanted to offer his assistance. He saw that we were tourists, and he knew that we shouldn't have been there. He told us so, telling us it wasn't a good place for us to be so late at night, and he offered us a ride back to the area where we were staying. Seeing he had lots of pots and pans and cooking paraphernalia in the back of his truck, and that he was obviously a street food vendor at the fish fry, we gratefully accepted. As he dropped us off on the road where we were staying, his passing comment and his instruction, as we thanked him profusely for his kindness and offered him some cash for his fuel and inconvenience that he refused to accept, was to suggest to us that if we ever saw him lost and in the wrong place in our country, that we would also stop to help him out. The lesson learned here is to take responsibility for your own safety, but also know that not everyone's out to get you. There are good people everywhere in the world, and in my experience, the kindness of strangers is far more widespread than you might expect. Number 2, thinking that we might be kidnapped in Central America. We'd arrived in Central America late at night on a planned layover into a city with a notorious reputation for being potentially dangerous, especially at night. I'd pre-arranged by email for our hotel to send a car for us. And this is a top travel tip. If you're unfamiliar with the place you're arriving, particularly at night, and you're not sure of the route to your hotel, then please do pre-arrange with your hotel to send out a car or a taxi to meet you. Ask for the driver to hold up a card with your name on it to avoid you having to get into an unknown car at airport arrivals. And after arriving at our hotel and checking in, we walked a short distance to a nearby fast food restaurant for something to eat. It had been a long flight and we were hungry. And perhaps because it was quite late in the evening, the restaurant was empty. We paid for and ordered our food, and then we sat in a booth with our drinks. And it was then that I happened to notice an old car pulling into the car park, and it parked directly in front of the window. The driver of the car looked right at me, and for some strange reason that I still can't fully explain, I felt spooked. The man came inside the restaurant. He glanced the menu, and then he deliberately looked our way once more. And once again I happened to catch eye contact with him. This time, I knew something was wrong. I had goosebumps, and my heart was racing. And when the man went back to his car, and I saw him still glancing our way, and now talking into his mobile phone, I took my hungry husband's hand, and I insisted that we were leaving immediately. We hurried back to our hotel and locked ourselves in our room. It's not completely unheard of for tourists to get kidnapped and held for ransom in some parts of Central America. And we'll never know if the danger that I instinctively felt was real or imagined, and I'm glad we never had to find out. The lesson learned here is to trust your gut. If a situation feels wrong, then act immediately to protect yourself and to feel safe. Number 3 is dealing with a drunk taxi driver in Asia. We'd just flown into a big city in Southeast Asia that we'd visited many times before, and so we felt confident about taking a registered airport taxi to our hotel. Only, after climbing into the back seat of the taxi, my husband and I both sniffed the air at the same time and looked at each other. We could both smell alcohol, and it seemed to be coming very strongly from the driver. This time, it was my backpacking husband who acted instinctively. He said, "No, stop," to the driver, and he turned to me and said, "Okay, we're getting out." And the lesson learned here is don't feel embarrassed about asserting yourself and putting your safety first in a compromising situation. Trust yourself. If something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. Number 4. This is a story that we laugh about now, but when it happened, it was quite stressful. It was a bus going off with our backpacks in Mexico. We were backpacking in Mexico, having flown into Cancun, and travelling by public bus along the coast. We spent some time in Playa del Carmen, heading over to the island of Cozumel on the ferry for a few days, and then we headed back to the mainland and continued by bus onto Tulum, set on seeing the famous Mayan ruins there. When we identified our stop just outside Tulum and our hotel just across the street, we alerted the bus driver to stop the bus and let us off. The problem was that as soon as we'd stepped down off the bus, he continued on without allowing us to collect our backpacks from the luggage compartment under the bus. We watched him drive away in stunned silence for a moment, and then we saw another bus coming along the road. We ended up chasing the bus with our backpacks on it all across town on the second bus until we were able to retrieve our stuff. The lesson learned here is if the unexpected happens, then don't panic. Look for a solution. Okay, we're at number 5, and this one, if you're scared of spiders, you might not like this one so much. It's about finding a tarantula in the bed in the Caribbean. We'd been on a small island in the Caribbean for a week when we were renting a small house in a tropical garden. There were beautiful flowers and plants everywhere, and trees laden with banana and cashew and coconuts. But unknown to us, this was the perfect habitat for the tarantula spider. So, of course, not long after staying in the house, we came home to find an enormous, hairy tarantula spider crawling across our bed. I will admit to you that my heart was pounding because back then I didn't really know if these types of spiders were poisonous or not. In fact, I've since learned that they're not poisonous, but they are known to fire their hairs at you as a defense mechanism when they are afraid. Feeling very afraid myself, I dashed next door to alert our landlady, who sent her rather amused husband to extract the spider on our behalf, while telling us that he used to keep a tarantula spider as a pet when he was a child. In our bedroom, he approached the huge hairy beast with a broom, onto which it dutifully crawled, before he put it back out into the garden. And the lesson learned here is if you are faced with local wildlife, try and find a local person who's willing to come and help you deal with it. Number 6. Finding a scorpion in the shower in Honduras. While in Honduras, Central America, I was horrified to be told by a new friend I'd met her scary story about how she had recently been hanging a washing outside and she'd been stung on the hand by a small black scorpion. She described the pain to me as horrific and, like being struck by a hammer, her hand was horribly swollen, and she said she was still in a great deal of pain. She also told me that luckily a local scorpion sting wasn't fatal. Well, that's good to know, but it didn't stop me feeling absolutely terrified when, just a few days later, I was taking a shower and happened to look down to see a black scorpion showering with me and crawling over the top of my foot. I didn't scream. I froze. I stood completely motionless, waiting for the hammer of pain to hit me or the scorpion to climb off my foot. Luckily, it moved away and disappeared into a small crevice in the corner of the shower base. Now, the lesson learned here is that I knew I wasn't in danger of death from the scorpion sting, but I was in danger of experiencing extreme pain. I now feel it's perhaps a good idea to be forewarned and to acquire some knowledge of any dangerous local wildlife while travelling to tropical places, so that you can assess the level of danger that you might be facing. We actually lived in that house for several months, not really knowing where the scorpion actually went, or if he would come back. But I learned to check for him every time I took a shower. Number 7. A venomous snake in the house. While we were house-sitting in a fabulous chateau in southwest France, we had an encounter with a very large venomous snake. Inside the chateau, the rooms were huge and the stone walls so thick that in the summer, when the temperatures outside were at their hottest, we had 42 degrees C, inside the house always remained refreshingly cool. And this was probably why a large and very long snake decided to come inside and go to sleep behind a piece of furniture. Having spotted the snake, we took a photo of it in order to identify it by its markings, and we discovered that it was a viper. It had slit pupils rather than round pupils, and from its distinct pattern and scales, that it was highly venomous. Not wanting to tackle it outside ourselves, while assuming there must be some kind of protocol in place for dealing with poisonous snakes in France, we went and sought the advice of our French neighbour. We explained our situation and we showed him the photo of the snake on our phone. And he looked startled. That's both the snake and now our neighbour. And he confirmed that the snake was indeed very dangerous. And he immediately armed himself with a broom, in the same way as our neighbour in the Caribbean has armed himself to catch the tarantula spider. But worryingly, when we all returned to the house, we discovered the snake was no longer behind the dresser and was in fact nowhere to be seen. We'd left the door open, so had it slithered away on its own accord? Or was there a hole somewhere in the stone walls of the chateau that enabled it to enter and exit the room whenever it chose to come inside? The lesson learned here was, well, we never did see the snake again, but for the whole time that we lived in the chateau, I learned to be vigilant. I was always careful whenever I moved anything or cleaned the floors around the furniture anywhere in the house. Now we're up to number 8, which is about the dentist, a root canal treatment in South Korea. Before the backpacking husband and I left Scotland, having sold everything we owned in order to travel the world, we had a checklist of preparations to travel. And one of the things on that list was to get a full dental checkup in order to preempt any future problems with our teeth while travelling. So I was both surprised and frustrated to find, just a few months into our travel itinerary, and while we were on a small island in the Caribbean with no dentist, that I had developed a toothache. The tooth ached mercilessly for weeks, and all I could do was swill it with a bit of rum and take a paracetamol. Then the pain seemed to settle down for a while, but it started up again when we set off on our travels. We'd taken a long flight to South Korea to visit our son, and I think perhaps the plane's cabin pressure had started my tooth off again. Thankfully, in South Korea, my son was able to arrange for me to see a dentist. The dentist's name, when translated to English, was the Happy Dentist, but I wasn't happy after my consultation to be told that I needed root canal treatment. However, this did solve the problem of my excruciatingly painful toothache. The lesson learned here is sometimes even when you try to preempt a situation, you really can't avoid every possible scenario. So what you can do is have a backup plan, and that should certainly include having travel insurance to cover any medical and dental emergencies while you're in another country. You might like to read a full post and article that I've written about travel insurance options on the backpackinghousewife.com. Next is number 9, getting a badly infected foot in Thailand. Hurting my foot in Thailand was actually an awful and extremely painful experience. My husband and I were walking down a steep path, ridiculously steep for a path actually. That's Thailand for you. And the path had dried in the sun after a heavy rainfall, leaving a fine sand screed that I slipped on in my flip-flops. I went down so quickly that I believe if I hadn't had my arm linked through my husband's, I would have probably broken a leg or something. Anyway, the damage seemed to be superficial at first, just a scrape to the top of my foot. 3 days later, however, and the foot was horribly infected. I cleaned and dressed the wound as best I could, but with all the heat and humidity in Thailand, it's common for even a small abrasion to get infected. I went to see a pharmacist and I spent a small fortune on antiseptic cream and dressings, but the foot soon got much worse. It looked horrible. It was so painfully infected I couldn't even put it down on the ground, never mind walk on it. So I went back to the pharmacist, who seemed surprised and concerned at seeing my foot in such a mess, and so he cleaned it for me and prescribed a very strong course of antibiotics. I can only describe the pain of having my infected foot cleaned, as it being hit by hammers and slashed with glass both at the same time. It was excruciating. The antibiotics started working after a few days and the foot eventually healed, but I was left with a nasty reminder of what had happened to me with a scar at the top of my foot. And a year later, I had the scar covered with a tattoo of a sea turtle in a coral garden, which I like much better. The lesson learned here is that sometimes accidents happen no matter how careful you are. I was simply walking down a steep street after it had rained. I wasn't drunk, I wasn't being silly, but I'd slipped and fell and hurt myself. It could have been worse, and again it's important that you have travel insurance to cover any medical costs while abroad. If you're in your 50s or 60s or older, it can be more expensive and difficult to get the right travel insurance for your needs, so you might like to read a post I've written especially for you. It's called Travel Planning, Travel Insurance for Over 50s, on my website at thebackpackinghousewife.com, or you can listen to it as a podcast, and it can be found listed as episode 12. Finally, number 10 on my scary travel situations experiences is suffering sandfly bites everywhere. Many people prepare for their holidays in warm or tropical places by including an insect repellent in their packing essentials to deter mosquitoes from biting them. But there's also another variety of biting and blood-sucking flies that cause terrible skin welts and skin swellings that many people call no-see-ums. These are tiny sandflies that are so small you cannot actually see them, only the damage they do to you. And unlike mosquitoes, who mostly prefer to attack at dusk, sandflies are fully active at all hours of the morning, noon and night. I was blissfully unaware of the existence of sandflies when I took myself down to the beach to lay on my towel and sunbathe one afternoon while on a beautiful island in the Caribbean. The sun was shining, palm trees swayed, the sea was blue and crystal clear as waves lapped the shoreline of the pristine white beach as I lay there feeling strange tingles all over my skin. I applied my sunscreen, thinking I was getting prickly heat, and carried on trying to enjoy my afternoon, and eventually, unbearably uncomfortable with my skin feeling itchy, I went for a swim, and then feeling restored, went back to the beach, picked up my towel, and headed for home. Home was the beautiful Caribbean-style beach hut that we'd just rented for our stay, where my husband was when he saw me, and he cursed like a pirate. I was unknowingly, at that moment, absolutely covered in tiny red sandfly bites. There was hardly a space between any of them, but the ones on my back were much worse, where I'd been lying on my towel on the sand. My husband took a photo of my back so that he could show me what it looked like, and I was horrified. A few hours later, and the tiny welts grew bigger, and were so itchy and looked so awful that I was driven quite mad. My only relief at that time was an antihistamine ointment that we'd sensibly brought with us to the island in our emergency travel kit. The lesson learned here is that sandflies are common all over the Caribbean and in many tropical places. I learned how to best deal with sandfly bites from talking to local people, who helpfully told me what I could do to treat the bites and to help prevent the sandflies attacking and biting me. I was also told that after spending about 3 months on the island, a person's natural immunity would usually kick in, meaning that the skin would not then react as badly to the sandfly bites. And I assume that's why the local people around me didn't appear to be suffering from sandfly bites or to be covered in the distinctive red welts. I've written a post on all the tips that I learned about dealing with sandflies and treating sandfly bites, especially for you on my website. The post is entitled Suffering Sandflies, the Dreaded No-See-Ums, and it's one of the most visited articles at thebackpackinghousewife.com. I do hope this post on scary travel horror stories has entertained and informed you, but not put you off travelling. If I'm not put off by all this, then neither should you be, because there is so much in this wonderful world to see and experience, and there are far more good people than bad people in the world. The kindness of strangers is far more widespread than you might think. So don't be put off by what may or may not ever happen. Instead, prepare yourself for anything by taking a leaf out of Commander Hadfield's wonderful book, An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth. You can buy it from Amazon and equip yourself with the knowledge and tools to overcome any fears that you may have troubling you, or any reticence that you might have in the back of your mind about travelling near or far. If you're over 50 years old, you might like to read my post, 10 Reasons to Travel in Your 50s and 60s, or listen to that as a podcast. You can find it listed as episode 1, and again it's one of my most listened to podcasts. And then bravely go after your dreams of travel and adventure. Do please get in touch. Let me know if you've got any similar scary travel stories to share, or any travel tips that you'd like to pass on to others. I'd love to hear from you. Email me through my contact page on my website at thebackpackinghousewife.com, or get in touch with me through my social media channels. I'm on Facebook as The Backpacking Housewife. I'm on Instagram as Janice Horton Writer. And if you're on Twitter, please do tweet to tell me about your travel plans, your travel stories at Janice Horton. That's JANICEHORTON. And come and travel with me here on Travel with the Backpacking Housewife podcast. Subscribe and follow for inspiring and informative new episodes each week, in which I'll be discussing ways to plan for and to prioritise travel and adventure in our lives and in our new future, in what is set to become a new and golden age of travel.